Hey guys, I'm Erin and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing you part 2 of my March wrap-up where I'm talking about all the non-speculative fiction I read. So for this video I have 9 books that I'm talking about, and I have 5 romance, 2 historical, 1 nonfiction, and 1 kind of just general fiction. And so my average rating of those 9 books is a 3.78, which is definitely lower than my average rating in my SFF wrap up, and I had 2 new favorite books this month and 2 ones I really didn't like. So kind of the spectrum this month. Starting with the 5 romance books I read, I'm just going to talk about them in the order I read them, and we're going to start off with the first one, which is also probably my most unpopular romance opinion, and that is The Hating Game by Sally Thorne, which I gave 2 stars. I did not like this book very much, which was shocking. This is definitely my most disappointing read to date in the year. I thought I was going to absolutely love this book. It's all over the place in kind of like a romance-landia, as like the pinnacle of this new modern contemporary romance. It's like the enemies to lovers that everyone points to as like the enemies to lovers example. Everyone loves it, and I just didn't. I just didn't like it. It's a story about Lucy and Josh, who are co-workers at this publishing company where they work for separate companies, and then their companies merged, and they have co-CEOs, and they're each the assistants to their respective CEO from the previous company. And it's a whole thing in the book how the 2 companies are kind of opposite personalities, and you definitely see that exaggerated with Lucy and Josh being very opposite personalities. And in the book, they are competing for the same promotion. So we have this enemies/rivals to lovers, office romance, competing for this promotion. And the enemies to lovers part, I just like never really understood why they hated each other. I just kind of always did. And Lucy, I didn't enjoy Lucy. I just found her very shallow. It was like the only thing she could talk about with Josh was his looks, which, I mean, I want some comments on looks in books, so I think that helps build, I think, physical sexual tension between characters, is like them talking about their opinions on their looks, but like that can't be the only thing. Like, you have to give me other descriptors, other opinions. I need more than just looks. As well, I just found her kind of childish in general, just her behavior. They did this thing where they played these games with each other that they call all the time, like the staring game or whatever. And I don't know, it all came across very, it was like too much in the, like, I could take, like, you could do some light teasing, some light animosity in the workplace, but it felt like the amount to which they did it came off as supremely unprofessional in a way that became kind of childish. And in addition, Josh was fine. I feel like all I knew about him was his looks. He was fine. My main problem was the plot just didn't work for me at all. As I said, I felt like a reading Whiplash, where there were some scenes that I genuinely enjoyed, which is why this is getting 2 stars and not 1. 1 being the paintball scene, which is kind of a big scene, and 1 being a sickbed scene. And I really enjoyed both of those scenes. I love a good sickbed, one character taking care of the other. I love that. But there was these other scenes that just literally didn't make sense. Like, their first kiss came out of freaking nowhere. It made no sense. It was like, in what world would someone behave like that, given what you've told us about these characters? Like, it wasn't like this, like, oh, they've been building this tension for half the book now and it's been coming. No, we hadn't gotten to that part yet. It just was out of nowhere, and that was kind of the first clue where I was like, maybe I won't love this book. Maybe I won't. Yeah, there was a couple other scenes too that would just pop in, and I'd be like, what is happening? Like, another one was when they, like, the first time they kind of talked about what their relationship was, kind of like they weren't in the dating stages yet. They had, like, kissed and had realized they were attracted to each other, but their discussion about what they wanted to be made no sense. It, like, one thing would be said and then immediately be contradicted, and it was just weird. So the plot really didn't go for me. At the end of the book, you have kind of the classic conflict. It'd been kind of building all book where there was something that Josh was kind of hiding, or there was some family drama that you didn't really know he wasn't talking about, and it came to light at the end. I think, like, what it was fine, but they revealed this conflict that'd been building all book, and then immediately he was like, oh, it's not actually a big deal. I'm like, you've been making it this big deal this whole book. Like, the author has been setting it up to be this huge deal, and then it just, like, wasn't a big deal. And so I was just like, what? There was no payoff for that. So, yeah, I didn't really like this one. She does have a new book coming out this year that sounds interesting, so I might give it a shot, see if I like it. But I, not going to go with high expectations for that one. So the next romance book I read was a very similar trope setup to The Hating Game, with office place romance, enemies/rivals to lovers competing for a promotion. And that was Shipped by Angie Hockman. And let me tell you, this book was freaking amazing. This book gave me everything from those tropes that The Hating Game didn't give me. I love this book. This book, so as I mentioned the tropes, but in this one, the two main characters have not met prior to the book. They live in different cities, and one of them teleworks and the other goes in the office. So they've never met face to face. They've only corresponded and like once or twice heard each other's voices over like conference calls. But they're both work in the kind of marketing department for this cruise ship line, and there is a new promotion available to like head of some of the marketing, and in order to compete for it, both characters are being sent on the Galapagos cruise, and they have to come up with a pitch to sell more tickets on this cruise. And so when they get to the cruise ship, that's the first time they meet in person. And so one thing it did better was the setup of the enemies part was incredible. It was like perfect to me. One thing I've heard people talk about is kind of enemies to lovers. The hard thing with that is having a reason for them to hate each other that's not insurmountable to overcome and believably then move past and fall in love. And so I thought the way this was done, in that our heroine hated the hero because throughout their email correspondence and messaging through work, he came off very rude and arrogant, and so she didn't like that. But in real life, when she actually meets him, she realizes he's not actually rude and arrogant. But I think this was set up really well, because if you're only communicating with people via written communication that you've never met in person, you lose all the context of tone and body language, and so it's really easy to misread written communication from people you don't know. And so then when they meet and he's not like that, it seemed totally believable that she like kind of within the course of a couple days switched her feelings, because it was the first time she met him in person. I think if you've met someone in person and gotten a bad first opinion or disliked them for something, it takes longer to get over it. I don't know. I just thought that setup of misreading tones in emails and thinking they're just mean was a good setup. I liked that setup a lot better. I also thought both of these characters were just much better characters. I liked both of them. They felt much more well-rounded. They were mature. They weren't really childish and shallow. So I liked that a lot better. I also, in addition to those tropes, I loved the setting of the Galapagos Islands on a cruise ship. It was a swoon-worthy Caribbean setting. And there also was this dash of kind of female empowerment subplot with the heroine and her trying to get this job promotion and her interactions with her boss, who's a jerk. So I absolutely love this book. This plot totally worked for me. I mean, unlike The Hating Game, this plot made sense. And so this is my new go-to recommendation for enemies to lovers. If you're looking for a contemporary romance, enemies to lovers, I gave this 5 stars. I loved it. The next romance I read was The Dating Plan by Sara Desai. This was just a really solid, fun romance. This one is one that I honestly don't have a lot of strong thoughts on. I really enjoyed reading it, but there wasn't like things that just like catapulted it to an amazing 5 stars. In this one, you have our heroine who bumps into a hero who she knew from her childhood. He was her brother's friend, and he was supposed to take her to prom, and he ghosted her, didn't show up, and then ghosted the family, and no one's heard from him. And so she's been holding this grudge against him since then. But so they bump into each other at this conference. He works for venture capitalists, and she works for a startup. And they decide to get fake engaged. She wants to get fake engaged to get her family off her back because they're trying to set her up with people. She comes from a Desai family who's very much into the setting up the kids with people to get married, starting a family kind of culture, and she just isn't interested. She's just interested in her work. So she wants this engagement to get her back, and then on his side, he finds out he's inherited this family distillery from his grandfather, but in order to keep it and not have it go to his brother, he has to be married by his next birthday, which I think was 3 months, in order to keep it. And his brother would sell the distillery because he left the family business and has his own business, but our hero wants to keep the distillery. So he's using this marriage as a way to keep this distillery, and he chooses her because he thinks there's like no way they'll actually fall in love. It's just a business deal. So fake dating, fake engagement, tropes that I love, and I just thought this was really cute. I think our heroine Daisy was definitely was edging a little bit onto too stereotypically nerdy, but she never quite crossed that line, so I still did like her, but every so often it was getting a little close there. And I really liked their relationship. I thought they had good chemistry, and I really enjoyed it. I also really enjoyed the distillery kind of storyline, as well as reading about Liam's relationship with his family. The next romance I read was a historical romance, which was To Sir Philip with Love by Julia Quinn. This is the 5th Bridgerton book. So book 5 was really a low point in the Bridgerton series for me. With the 5 romance books, I had 2 stars, which was not ideal. But I really didn't like this book, which was really sad because this was Eloise's story, and I really like Eloise, and she deserved a better book. In this one, Eloise is becoming spinster age. She's rejected a bunch of marriage proposals, and she starts corresponding with Phillip, who was married to her cousin until her cousin Marina passed away. And so Phillip is looking for a wife to be a mother to his children. And after a couple exchanging letters with Eloise, she's like, she seems fine. Let me ask her to marry me. So he writes her and asks her to marry him. She doesn't respond at first, and then eventually kind of flees the season and goes to Philip's kind of, I guess, manor out in the country without telling any of her family to kind of suss out the situation, decide if she wants to marry him or not. And they get to know each other. She gets to know his kids. Her family finds out, and the Bridgerton brothers kind of arrive at Philip's manor. Like, Eloise, what the heck? You ran off. You didn't tell anyone. You're at this guy's manor with no chaperone, which is very scandalous in the time of the historical romances. But I just didn't like it. Here's the thing. Philip was the worst. That's mostly why I hated it, because I didn't like Philip. He was a horrible father, and part of the storyline was definitely him trying to figure out how to be there for his kids and like how to be a good father. But I think there was a way to have that character progression without the starting point being so bad. He just like was a totally neglectful father, and that was just too much. And it made me hate him to a point where he was not redeemable for me. He ignored his kids. He didn't, at the beginning of the book, they just want to spend time with him, and he's begging them off, and Eloise is they just want to spend time with you, what are you doing? And so I think there could have been better ways to start that story arc. It could have been him caught up in the grief of losing his wife that was kind of marring it, but it wasn't that. It was kind of he was never really there for them. Or it could have been he was there for some things, but the wife was there for other things, and he just really didn't know how to handle the other things and was kind of learning how to be there for that. There was ways to do it. I do understand that the dad kind of not really being there at all is kind of how it was in the times, but here's the thing. Even if sometimes historical accuracies don't make for good stories. That's not what I want to read. So that was my problem with that, was he just started too bad. On the scale of bad father, he was too far bad for me to enjoy. As well, I didn't like the way this book talked about depression, because Marina died as a result of a failed suicide attempt. And the way they talked about depression, which, they didn't use the word depression because that's not what they would have called it back then, which was fine. But the way they talked about it and the way Philip talked and thought about her was just icky. It was it made it seem like people with depression weren't worth being with, which I thought was gross. And the way he kind of talked about their physical sex life in wake of her depression also really rubbed me the wrong way. And again, mental health issues weren't as understood back there, so the dad being present, I'm sure this was somewhat historically accurate, but again, sometimes historical accuracy doesn't make for entertaining or enjoyable stories. And so if I'm reading a historical romance, just looking for a good romance, doesn't have to be 100% historical accurate in ways that would make the story worse. I also never really believed Philip and Eloise's relationship, and the whole book was them falling for each other, and it definitely, the marriage started out as kind of a marriage of convenience, or more of a business arrangement, which was fine. I don't have a problem with that. I think that's kind of common with some of the historicals that I've read, especially in the Bridgertons, where sometimes when they get married, one may have feelings but the other aren't there, and they get married for a different reason, but the love comes in the second half of the book. But this one, I never felt like the love came. I think the story was so focused on Philip trying to be a good father that it neglected actually developing Eloise and Philip's relationship. So I really didn't like this one. It did have a couple bright spots. I really liked the kids, and I really liked Eloise's relationship with the kids. As well, we had some cameos from the Bridgerton brothers, and I love that. Love the Bridgerton brothers, so that was also fun. But the last romance I read last month was the 6th Bridgerton book, which was When He Was Wicked, and this one was back to the Bridgerton books I know and love, and I gave this one 4 stars. This one follows Francesca, who is married to John Sterling. In the beginning of the book, John dies, and John's cousin Michael has been in love with Francesca since the moment he met her, and it's about Francesca and Michael's relationship and them coming together. And so first off, I have to say, the book started before John died, and I was really nervous we were going to have like a very quick transition from John to Michael, which wasn't going to sit well with me because it made it very clear that Francesca and John were a love match, and so like that quick transition was going to be bad. But very glad the author didn't do that. She did a 4-year time skip before the relationship started, which was A+. But overall, I really liked Francesca and Michael, both as characters. If you are someone who likes pining in your romance book, this one has so much frickin' pining, especially from Michael. So much pining. It was great. I really liked it. I do wish we'd gotten a little bit more of Michael and Francesca before John's death, because Michael talks about falling in love with her the moment he met her, which is kind of insta-lovey. And then it didn't really show them interacting much pre-death. There was like kind of one scene. And so I just wanted to see more of like kind of why he fell in love with her. And that's kind of a minor problem. Like accepting that he was in love with her and then reading the rest of the book, it was still good. I just wish we'd had a little bit more background on that. As well, there was this chunk towards the end that I just didn't like. It was like a couple chapter chunk after Michael tried to propose the first time and did a horrible job at it. Francesca's actions in like the next couple of chapters I was not into, because I understood why she didn't want to accept, because I mean I could tell, because she like didn't want to feel like she was betraying John, but she just like couldn't figure out, I don't know, she like did not communicate to Michael why she was saying no at all, and I was just like, freaking tell him something. It was very infuriating, that behavior there. It was I felt like she was dragging him along because she was still like making out with him and stuff, and I was just like, girl, you gotta say yes or stop dragging him along. But it did resolve very well. The resolution to where they finally got their feelings out was a great scene, so it ended very well, and I gave this one 4 stars. Next up, I read 2 historical fiction books. The first was The Women of Chateau Lafayette by Stephanie Dray. This was an e-arc that I received from NetGalley, and I have a full, very fleshed out, several paragraph long review on Goodreads that I'll link below if you want my full thoughts on it. But in brief, this was a story about 3 women, so it was a trio storyline or timeline, kind of revolving around this castle, Chateau Lafayette in France. We had the Marquis de Lafayette, the revolutionary hero. His wife was one storyline, and it was kind of her story from youth through end of her life. And then we had a second storyline in World War I, following Beatrice, who was an actress turned socialite and do-gooder. What's the word? Like a word for people who do charity, and I'm totally blanking. But that's her, and so she, during World War I, does a lot of charity with helping the troops, and she ends up helping set up this charity at the Chateau Lafayette, which was Lafayette's birthplace, where they help children with tuberculosis as they heal. And then the third storyline was following Marthe, who had grown up and was now a teacher at that chateau during World War II. And so I really did enjoy this. I gave it 4 stars. I think Marthe's storyline, World War II storyline, was my favorite. It just felt nonstop. I was always invested in her storyline and what was happening with her and the kids at the chateau during World War II, as well as her actions in trying to help hide and help Jewish families. I liked the other 2 storylines, but both of them had lulls in them where I felt like it dragged some before it picked back up. I think one thing that made this a great historical fiction to me is the first 2 characters. So, I mean, obviously the Marquis de Lafayette's wife was a real person. Marquis de Lafayette was, again, American Revolutionary War hero, main character in the musical Hamilton. But the second character, Beatrice, was also a real person. And so I did a lot of researching, especially during their storylines, about the events and people and stuff that they were talking about, which to me is a mark for what I like in historical fiction, as well as that make me learn more about the events they're writing about, because obviously the books are fiction or fictionalized versions of events. And so I was constantly Wikipediaing these different places and people and events, and I really like it when historical fiction drives me to do that. So that was me a mark of a good historical fiction. I do think this book could have been a little shorter. It was almost 600 pages, which is very long for historical fiction in my experience, and as I said, the first two storylines just had some lulls, so I think you probably could have cut down on that. But if you want to hear more drawn out thoughts on each of them, I will link that Goodreads review. So the second historical fiction book I read, which was the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Society by Mary Ann Shaffer. So this got turned into a movie, I think in 2018, and it is one of my all-time favorite romantic movies. I love it. I've seen it so many times. It's on Netflix if you're in the US. Definitely go check it out if you're into period dramas of any kind. And so I never read the book, and so I decided to finally go ahead and pick it up. I will say this is one adaptation that I actually enjoy the movie better. I think it just did the story a little better, and I did like the movie a tad better, but I did quite enjoy the book. I gave it 4 stars. This was told in an epistolary format, which generally I enjoy epistolary formats, but I don't think it was the right choice for this book because there were too many different letter recipients, in my opinion. Like, you had the main character, Juliet, who's a writer, and she gets this letter from Desai, who lives on Guernsey, because he received this used book that had her address in it, and he was writing saying how much this book meant to him during the war and wanted to get more books from this author. And so they started correspondence, and she learns about this hidden book club that the people, him and a couple friends on Guernsey did, because they were out one night and got caught by the German soldiers, because Guernsey was under occupation during World War II, and they made up this book club to hide while they're out, and then they did the book club. And so she's exchanges letter with him about it, and then she starts exchanging letters with all the different members of the book club so she can write an article about it. And I just think there was too many different people that she was exchanging letters with to be an effective use of the epistolary format. I think I would have preferred either to just not do the epistolary format or do what the movie did and keep the epistolary format, which, I mean, the movie didn't really use the epistolary format because it's a movie, right? But do what the movie did plot-wise and have her exchange letters with just Desai and then go to the island and meet all the members in person. I just think meeting them in person was just a better way to show the relationships she built with these people that she became friends with. But other than that, I did still really enjoy the book because, again, it's generally the same plot as the movie, and I really love the movie. The book did have an extra plot line that wasn't in the movie that I really quite enjoyed. I think it was totally fair the movie left it out because, I mean, you can only fit so much in an hour-and-a-half movie. But I think it did add to the story, and I am glad I read the book and read this extra storyline. So I also read one nonfiction book, which was The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. This is a story about girls starting in the 20s, going a decade or two, who worked in radium watch factories that used radium paint to paint on watches to make them glow in the dark. And at the time, people didn't really understand how dangerous radium was, and these girls were being exposed to it with no safety equipment, no safety clothing. They would, when they were painting, to get the little tips on their brushes to get pointy, to get like small lettering, they would put it in their mouth with radium on it. Like, that's freaking wild. And so they started getting sick and dying, and at some point, doctors started kind of figuring out maybe it was the radium, and so it's about the court cases and kind of the legal battles that these women and their families went through over a period of like 20 years to try and, get compensation from these companies for doing it, as well as bringing awareness, and eventually the result of these trials is a lot of new safety precautions were made, and nowadays it sounds crazy to you and me to put freaking radium in your mouth, right? Like, that's wild because now we understand. But this story was truly horrifying. It was wild too, like just the disregard these companies had. I can't say I'm surprised, but it was wild to read about. If you have a weak stomach, maybe don't read this book because they kind of go quite detailed into the body effects of radium poisoning. And let me tell you, radium poisoning can hit you different. So there's a lot of differing kinds of descriptions here. It's a lot. It's very gross. It was a very interesting and I think important read, especially since by the time at the end when they finally won court case, it took like 13 years from them to win their first court case. It did have change. It brought about change. So I gave this book 4 stars. I really liked the story, but I did have a couple issues with the writing. One is that I feel like the author tried to inject a lot of kind of dramatization in the way she wrote that it didn't need, and it got kind of old. It kind of felt like every chapter was ending in those like, and they didn't know it was the last time they'd say goodbye kind of statements, and it just kind of got old. But I certainly can't give it less than a 4 stars because the story itself was very impactful, and I'm glad the writer, even though I had some issues, decided to write this novel and talk about this. I did also recently learn there's also a movie adaptation on Netflix, so I might give that a watch. And the last book I read was the last book I read in the month across both wrap-ups, and it was my favorite book of the month, and that is Anxious People by Fredrick Backman. I loved this book. So this book is about a bank robbery gone wrong, and where this person tries to rob a bank, runs across the street running from the bank, and ends up holding an apartment full of prospective buyers who are there for a viewing, holding them hostage. But it's not like a intense thriller drama. It's totally kind of lighthearted, and the best word I can use to describe this book is zany. It was very zany. I have read Fredrick Backman before. I read 2 books by him, Beartown and its sequel, Us Against You, which were both super heavy, serious books. Wonderful books, but super heavy and serious, so I was not expecting this book to make me laugh so much. It was so funny. There's this one chapter in particular that's really kind of one of the first chapters where you really are seeing all the different hostages in the apartment and like hearing them talk to each other and about each other, and it was hilarious. I was sitting on the couch reading it with my husband, and I felt like I was reading out like every other sentence. I was like, wait, you gotta hear this one, it's so funny. And I loved it. The way he does humor was great. It was so funny, and I really loved it. I think upon reading reviews, I've learned this more whimsical, humorous style of book is more his speed, and Beartown was more the exception versus Anxious People being the exception, which makes me just even more excited to read his other books because I loved it. I think the cast of characters we had were so entertaining, and he did a really good job with humanizing each character. On the surface, they all kind of seem a little quirky and weird, but as you kind of talk to each character, you really learn so much about who they are, and just really humanizes them, and it really just makes them feel like someone you would know in real life, like these normal people. This book also deals with a lot of heavy subjects while keeping the tone overall pretty light. It talks about anxiety a lot, depression, there's suicide mentions. It's just, he puts so much into this book, and I was really impressed with the way he still kept this light, humorous tone while still, I think, fully addressing these heavier themes that he wanted to talk about and interweave, and it didn't feel like he was making light of them or a mockery of them or anything like that. In addition, there was definitely a little bit of a mystery to it because, so there's the hostages, and then you also have these 2 police officers who were investigating, and so they got the hostages out, but then they lost the bank robber, and so the mystery is figuring out what happened, where the bank robber went, and so the mystery kept me guessing. It would throw in a couple twists every now and then where I wasn't expecting them, and it really kept me on my toes, and kept me interested in the mystery plot as well. And with this investigation going on, you had transcripts of the interrogations about each hostage kind of interwoven in between normal prose chapters, and I really liked the way that was done. It felt like a very good way to kind of jump between talking about certain, like focusing on specific characters within the apartment. It was just really well done. I absolutely adored this book. This was definitely my favorite book of the month. The ending almost had me crying, and I cry pretty easily, except when I'm reading. Books don't make me cry very often, so 100% recommend this book. So those are the 9 non-speculative fiction books I read in March. If you've read any of these below, let me know what you thought of them, and everyone, go pick up Anxious People right now and read it. I will see you in my next video.